It was an ordinary day in the courtroom, a typical, almost mundane setting, with the faint hum of quiet chatter filling the air. But everything was about to change when 19-year-old Elijah Cooper stepped into the room. His jeans were a bit too baggy, his shirt unpressed, and his sneakers, worn down from the streets he had walked, gave no hint of the storm he was about to unleash. The spectators in the courtroom eyed him curiously, whispering under their breath. Elijah didn't fit the typical image of someone walking into a courthouse. He didn't look like he belonged in a room filled with seasoned lawyers, business people, and high-profile defendants. He didn't have the polished confidence of someone used to this environment. He looked like an underdog. The sound of the gavel echoed as Judge Rebecca Larson, a woman known for her stern demeanor and unwavering command of the room, raised her hand and called the case to order. Elijah's case, an alleged minor traffic violation, seemed like just another routine docket entry, destined to be quickly dismissed. But the young man standing before the judge, a slight tremble in his hands but a fire in his eyes, wasn't the same as the usual defendants. Judge Larson's gaze settled on him as she folded her hands, her voice cutting through the silence. "Mr. Cooper," she said, her tone firm and slightly condescending, "you do realize that the court doesn't take kindly to those who waste our time, don't you?" Elijah stood up straight, ignoring the laughter that came from the gallery. His heart pounded, and the uncertainty of what he was about to do filled the air between them. But he wasn't here to back down. He had come to make a point, one that would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. "Yes, Your Honor," Elijah replied, keeping his voice steady despite the nerves that threatened to overwhelm him. "I'm here to defend myself." Judge Larson raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a knowing smirk. "Defend yourself, huh? This should be good," she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for the room to hear. The laughter from the gallery intensified, but Elijah didn't flinch. He had prepared for this moment. Every insult, every sneer, every doubt. It was all part of the challenge he had to face. "Very well, proceed," Judge Larson said with an air of dismissal, as though the case was already decided in her mind. "Let's see what you've got, Mr. Cooper. Let's see what kind of defense you can mount." From the very beginning, Elijah's defense appeared like something out of an underdog movie. A traffic ticket, a simple dispute over speed, and an unprepared young man standing alone against a judge and an experienced attorney. But what everyone in the courtroom thought would be a quick and easy dismissal was turning into something more remarkable. Elijah began recounting the events of the incident, the speeding ticket. It seemed simple enough, but instead of the usual excuses or apologies that judges like Larson had grown accustomed to, Elijah approached the matter with a precision that left the room in stunned silence. "I'm not here to say I wasn't speeding," he began, his tone quiet but firm. "But the officer's reading is wrong. The equipment they used was faulty, and there's a clear discrepancy between where the officer was positioned and where the radar would have been able to accurately detect my speed." Elijah's voice remained steady as he began referencing road conditions and timestamps, the specifics of the ticket reading, and the exact location of the officer. The gallery was now silent, the laughter replaced with puzzled expressions. Some of the spectators who had previously sneered at Elijah began shifting in their seats. Judge Larson's hand paused midair, her pen hovering over the paper, her expression unreadable. Elijah continued with his argument, referencing specific statutes in the traffic code, sections of the law that were usually cited by seasoned lawyers, not teenagers. "Under California Vehicle Code Section 233, Your Honor," Elijah said, "there's a requirement that radar measurements must be calibrated and tested regularly. The officer did not produce any proof of that calibration. The reading, therefore, is inadmissible as evidence." Judge Larson's eyes narrowed. She had not expected this. This was not the kind of defense she had anticipated. A teenager, wearing scuffed sneakers, was now citing legal codes with more precision than most lawyers she had seen in her courtroom. "Your Honor," Elijah continued, his voice gaining strength, "if the evidence is flawed, then the charges against me cannot be justified." The gallery, which had been full of skeptical murmurs just moments ago, was now eerily quiet. Everyone in the room, even the judge, seemed to be paying attention. Judge Larson cleared her throat and looked at the opposing counsel, a seasoned attorney who had handled hundreds of traffic disputes. "Mr. Clark," she said, "do you have anything to say about this?" Mr. Clark, the opposing attorney, stood up, clearly taken aback. Your Honor, this is a minor traffic violation. We don't need to get bogged down in technicalities. But Elijah wasn't done. He had come prepared, and he wasn't going to let anyone undermine his case. With all due respect, sir, Elijah said, his voice now rising with authority, the law isn't about technicalities, it's about justice. And if the system can't even get the basics right, if it doesn't follow its own rules, then it's not doing its job. The courtroom shifted once more. People were no longer laughing at Elijah, no longer dismissing him as an unqualified young man. They were watching in awe as he methodically, with impressive clarity, broke down the case against him. Judge Larson, who had been waiting to shut down Elijah's argument, suddenly found herself in a position she wasn't used to. She was no longer looking at a naive young man with a case she could easily dismiss. She was now looking at a young person who had more legal knowledge than most seasoned lawyers she knew. The quiet murmur of the gallery grew louder as Elijah's final point hit home. He had presented a motion to dismiss the charges based on the flawed evidence. As he finished speaking, Judge Larson's eyes lingered on him for a long moment. Her stern expression softened just slightly, the smallest glimmer of surprise flickering in her eyes. For a second, the room was still. The entire courthouse had fallen into a state of suspended disbelief. The judge, usually so in control of every situation, was now considering something she hadn't expected. The possibility that this 19-year-old might actually know what he was talking about. Finally, Judge Larson broke the silence. Mr. Cooper, she said, her voice no longer as dismissive as it had been at the beginning, you've presented a compelling argument. And to be frank, I did not expect that from someone your age. Elijah stood tall, meeting her gaze without hesitation. He had come here to make a point, not just to defend himself, but to show that intelligence, talent, and legal knowledge could come from anywhere. Judge Larson adjusted her glasses, the reality of the situation sinking in. I must admit, Mr. Cooper, I misjudged you. You've demonstrated a level of understanding of the law that's far beyond your years. I'm going to grant your motion to dismiss. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The opposing counsel was speechless, unable to respond. Elijah's heart raced, but this time it wasn't from nerves. It was from a sense of victory. As the sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, the ripple of applause that started in the gallery was unmistakable. Elijah's story was no longer just about a young man winning a traffic dispute. It was about challenging expectations, breaking down biases, and proving that greatness can come from the most unlikely of places. As the gavel came down, a feeling of disbelief settled over the room. The courtroom was filled with a charged silence that seemed to linger, vibrating through the air. Judge Larson sat still, her eyes scanning the courtroom, her hands resting on her desk. She had just made a decision, but it was a decision she would never forget. Elijah Cooper, the young man she had almost dismissed as unprepared, had turned the entire court against her expectations. Mr. Cooper, Judge Larson began again, her voice no longer harsh or dismissive, but tinged with something else, respect perhaps. Your motion to dismiss has been granted. I've never seen a defense like that in my years on the bench. You've shown me that there is more to this case than I could have imagined. You've reminded me of something I needed to learn. Elijah's heart raced. He wasn't sure whether the adrenaline that surged through him was from the victory itself or the recognition that had just been bestowed upon him. He stood in stunned silence for a moment, the weight of the moment settling on him. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been underestimated, anyone who had ever walked into a room feeling like they didn't belong. The applause from the gallery grew louder, and for a moment Elijah thought it might consume the entire room. He couldn't help but smile faintly, even though he tried to keep his expression calm. Behind him, the opposing counsel, Mr. Clark, stood, his face flushed with embarrassment. His years of experience had been rendered irrelevant in the blink of an eye. He had assumed that his polished arguments and deep knowledge of the law would overwhelm a young man like Elijah, but that assumption had proven to be his greatest mistake. As Mr. Clark sat down, defeated and speechless, Elijah turned back to Judge Larson. Her demeanor had shifted completely. The stern, no-nonsense judge who had once looked at him with derision now regarded him with an expression of awe. "I have to ask, Mr. Cooper," Judge Larson said, her voice softer than before. "Where did you learn all of this?" Elijah, for the first time in hours, allowed himself a deep breath. "I've been studying law for years, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I've been preparing for this moment for a long time. I might be young, but I know what I'm talking about." A murmur spread through the gallery, a wave of surprise and admiration flowing from the onlookers. Some of them had been ready to dismiss him as just another teenager playing at something he didn't understand, but they had underestimated him. Now they were witnessing something far more powerful, a young man not only defending himself, but challenging the very assumptions of a system that often underestimated people like him. Judge Larson looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide what to say next. Finally, she spoke again, her voice carrying a note of genuine respect. "I'm impressed, Mr. Cooper. You've shown me that intelligence and competence come in all forms. You've reminded me that appearances can be deceiving." As Elijah walked out of the courtroom, his mind was still processing the events that had just unfolded. He had entered that room with little more than a few papers in his hand and a deep belief in his ability to stand up for what was right. Now, as he stepped into the hallway, he was met with a whirlwind of flashing cameras and microphones thrust toward him. "Elijah, Elijah, do you have a moment? How does it feel to win your first case in court? Is it true you passed the bar at 18? The reporters shouted questions at him, trying to get a soundbite, but Elijah was overwhelmed. The attention was sudden and intense. He had never expected this. But then again, he had never walked into that courtroom expecting anything. He had only come to defend himself. He hadn't anticipated becoming a national story. He raised his hand slightly, signaling for quiet. The questions stopped for a moment, and Elijah finally spoke. "I came here today to defend myself, just like anyone else would. I didn't expect anything except fairness, and that's exactly what I got," he said, his voice calm but with a quiet authority that matched the confidence he had shown in the courtroom. The reporters fell silent for a moment, clearly impressed by his humility and poise. This wasn't the arrogant response they had been expecting. This was something deeper, something that struck a chord with everyone who had been watching. Elijah wasn't just a young man defending himself against a speeding ticket. He was a symbol of resilience, determination, and defying the odds. Within hours, the video of Elijah's closing argument had gone viral. The clip of him presenting his defense, citing legal codes, and challenging the very credibility of the evidence was shared across social media, amassing millions of views. People couldn't get enough of it. Comments flooded in from all over the world, praising his intelligence, his eloquence, and his unwavering belief in justice. Some people were shocked by his brilliance, while others were outraged by the way he had been treated by the judge and the opposing attorney. But no matter what they said, everyone agreed on one thing. Elijah Cooper had just shown the world that you should never judge a book by its cover. As the days passed, Elijah's story continued to spread. News outlets from across the country reached out for interviews, asking him to share his thoughts on the case and his journey. He was invited to appear on talk shows, and his social media following grew by the minute. What started as a simple traffic dispute had evolved into a national conversation about bias, resilience, and the power of defying expectations. But with the attention came challenges. Not everyone was impressed by Elijah's success. There were those who questioned his abilities, framing his victory as a fluke or a product of luck rather than hard work. Critics painted him as a young man who had simply gotten lucky, who had somehow tricked the system into thinking he was a legal expert, when in reality, he was just a teenager with a lot of luck on his side. Some even tried to discredit his abilities, arguing that he had no business representing himself in court. They called him naive and unqualified, but they could not take away the fact that Elijah had won. His knowledge of the law was undeniable, and the motion to dismiss was granted because of the merit of his arguments, not because of some coincidence. Meanwhile, Judge Larson faced her own reckoning. In interviews, she openly admitted to underestimating Elijah. She said that her initial dismissal of him had been a wake-up call, a moment that forced her to confront her own biases. "That young man," she said in one interview, "reminded me of why I entered this profession in the first place. Justice is about fairness. It's not about assumptions or biases. Elijah showed me that. Her transformation, like Elijah's, became a story in itself. She had spent years presiding over cases, confident in her ability to make judgments based on first impressions. But Elijah had made her realize that true justice requires more than that. It requires listening, questioning, and above all, fairness. Elijah's story had a ripple effect far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Schools reached out, inviting him to speak at assemblies, to tell his story to young people who might be struggling with the same prejudices and obstacles he had faced. Advocacy groups that championed equality and fairness invited him to join their causes, and law firms, recognizing his brilliance, offered him internships and mentorship opportunities. But Elijah didn't let the fame get to his head. He didn't seek out the spotlight. Instead, he used his newfound platform to advocate for those who, like him, had been underestimated, marginalized, and ignored. He shared his story with others, encouraging them to challenge the assumptions that society places on them. He told young people that success is not about where you come from or what people think of you. It's about your determination to succeed, your willingness to work hard, and your ability to believe in yourself, even when others don't. Months passed, and Elijah continued to forge his path, undeterred by the attention and the scrutiny. He remained focused on his studies, using the momentum from his courtroom victory to fuel his future. He knew that his journey was far from over. He had already proven his brilliance in the courtroom, but he was just getting started. In a heartfelt speech at a community event, Elijah summed up his journey. "I didn't walk into that courtroom to prove anyone wrong. I walked in to prove myself right. We all have moments when people doubt us, but those moments aren't walls. They're doors waiting to be opened, and it's up to us to walk through them." The crowd erupted into applause, and Elijah stood there, humbled by the response. He had shown them all what it meant to defy expectations and to challenge the system that sought to hold him back. Elijah's story became a beacon of hope, not just for young aspiring lawyers, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated. He proved that intelligence, talent, and perseverance could emerge from the most unexpected places. For him, the journey was just beginning, and he was determined to use his platform to inspire others, to challenge the barriers placed in their paths, and to remind everyone that success is about persistence, preparation, and defying the odds. As his story continued to inspire people across the nation, Elijah knew one thing for sure: he wasn't done yet.